My daughter-in-law ripped my wife's wig off at my son's wedding, revealing her bruised and bare scalp from months of brutal chemotherapy. And the worst part? Some of her friends actually laughed. I did not scream. I did not cause a scene. I calmly stepped onto the stage, covered my trembling wife with my suit jacket, and handed my daughter-in-law the wedding envelope she had been begging for. When she tore it open and saw the legal documents inside, her arrogant smile vanished, instantly replaced by sheer terror. If you are just starting to watch this story, take a deep breath, because what I am about to tell you is a nightmare I never imagined would unfold within my own family. If you have ever had to deal with ungrateful relatives or someone who mistook your kindness for weakness, please hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the rest of my story, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. It means the world to me. My name is Richard Harrison. I am 70 years old, and for the last 4 decades, I built a logistics and supply chain empire right here in Chicago. I did not inherit a single dime. I started with one leased truck and worked my way up to a fleet that crossed the entire country. But a few years ago, I sold half my shares and took an early retirement for one reason only: to care for my wife, Patty. Patty is 68, and she has been battling late-stage lymphoma. The chemotherapy has been completely unforgiving. It took her hair, it took her energy, and some days it takes her spirit. Our primary home, a beautiful multi-story house we lived in for 30 years, had become a daily obstacle course for her. The stairs were just too much for her frail body. She needed to be on a ground floor, and she needed to be closer to the downtown oncology center, where she received her weekly treatments. That was my only priority: providing comfort and dignity for the woman who had stood by my side when I had absolutely nothing. 6 months before the disastrous wedding, I found the perfect place: a spacious ground-floor condominium just 10 minutes from Patty's hospital. It was exactly what she needed. Because Patty required round-the-clock care and I refused to leave her side for long, my 32-year-old son Lucas offered to handle the real estate transaction. Lucas used to be my absolute pride and joy. I paid for his college, I supported him, and I trusted him implicitly. So I wrote a cashier's check for $150,000. It was the exact amount required for the down payment and closing costs. I handed it to my son, believing he was taking a burden off my shoulders. 3 days later, I needed to confirm that the funds had been properly deposited into the real estate escrow account. I wanted to surprise Patty with the keys that weekend. I drove down to my primary bank branch in downtown Chicago. It was a crisp Tuesday morning. I walked up to the counter and greeted Mrs. Gable, the branch manager, who had handled my corporate accounts for over 15 years. I asked her to pull the clearance records for the cashier's check I had issued to Lucas. I just wanted a simple paper trail for my files. Mrs. Gable clicked away at her keyboard. She looked at her screen, frowned slightly, and adjusted her glasses. She told me that the check had indeed cleared the previous afternoon. I felt a brief wave of relief, thinking the condo was finally ours. But then she printed out the scanned copy of the endorsed check and slid it across the counter. I looked down at the paper. You do not survive 40 years in the cutthroat logistics industry by ignoring numbers or failing to read the fine print. My brain is wired to track every single cent, every route, and every ledger. The moment my eyes hit the endorsement line on the back of the check, my blood ran absolutely cold. The payee was not a real estate title company. It was not an escrow account. The $150,000 had been endorsed and deposited directly into the corporate account of a high-end luxury auto group in the Gold Coast district. I stood there in the quiet lobby of the bank, staring at the ink on the paper. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a banking error. Maybe Lucas had somehow mixed up the accounts. But the numbers do not lie. The routing codes were clear. The money I had meticulously saved, the money that was supposed to secure a safe and painless home for my dying wife, had just been washed into a car dealership. I did not panic loudly. I thanked Mrs. Gable, took the printout, folded it neatly, and placed it into my inner coat pocket. My hands were perfectly steady, but inside a quiet, terrifying storm was brewing. I walked out to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, gripping the steering wheel. I remembered a conversation from a week prior. Lucas had asked me to help pay for a specialized medical bed for Patty, a bed that cost $5,000. Just the day before, he had called me sounding incredibly stressed, claiming that the family trust was temporarily tied up in investments, and that he could not process the payment for the bed right now. He had told me things were tight, and yet here was a cleared check for $150,000 at a luxury car dealer. I started the engine. I did not drive back to my house. I drove straight toward the upscale neighborhood where Lucas lived with his fiancée, Victoria. Victoria was 29 years old, a luxury real estate agent who always seemed to view our family not as people but as a networking opportunity. She was deeply materialistic, always talking about optics, branding, and social status. I had always tried to look past her flaws because Lucas claimed he loved her. I wanted my son to be happy. But as I navigated the Chicago traffic, the pieces of a very dark puzzle began to fall into place. The drive took 30 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Every mile brought a new wave of realization. I was not just a father going to check on his son. I was an auditor walking into a crime scene. I pulled onto their quiet, tree-lined street. The neighborhood was filled with manicured lawns and expensive homes. As I approached their property, I slowed my car down, pulling over to the curb just a few houses away. I looked through my windshield toward their wide, paved driveway. What I saw in that exact moment completely shattered whatever remaining illusion I had about my son and his future wife. There, gleaming under the morning sun, sat a brand new, fully loaded Porsche Cayenne. The dealer plates were still on the back. And standing right in front of it was Victoria. She was wearing designer sunglasses and a tight outfit, holding her phone high in the air. She was practically dancing around the vehicle, smiling widely, posing and taking selfies from every possible angle for her social media. I sat in my car watching this woman celebrate. She was posing with a luxury vehicle bought with the exact funds meant to keep my dying wife from suffering on a staircase. The money meant for Patty's comfort was currently reflecting the sun off a German luxury SUV. Victoria was laughing, completely oblivious to the fact that I was watching her. She had no idea that the quiet, retired old man she always dismissed was sitting just 100 feet away, holding the bank statement that exposed her greed. I stood by my car door for a moment, just observing the scene. I watched Victoria lean against the hood of the Porsche, adjusting her hair for another photo. The sheer audacity of it was suffocating. I had spent my entire life building security for my family. I had worked 18-hour days, missed holidays, and sacrificed my own youth so that my son would never know the anxiety of an empty bank account. I had handed over that check with the pure, unconditional love of a father trying to protect his sick wife. And they had taken that love, that vulnerability, and twisted it into a status symbol to park in their driveway. Every click of her phone camera felt like a direct insult to Patty's suffering. While my wife was sitting in a recliner too weak to walk up to her own bedroom, Victoria was curating an image of wealth and success on the internet. The contrast was so stark, so utterly repulsive that a cold, hardened resolve settled over my heart. I was no longer just a grieving husband. I was a man who had been robbed. I closed my car door with a solid, heavy thud and began to walk up the driveway toward her. I did not know exactly what lie they were going to tell me, but I knew one thing for certain. I was going to let them dig their own grave. I walked up the smooth, gray concrete of their driveway. The morning air was crisp, but my chest burned with a heat I had not felt in decades. My footsteps were slow and deliberate. Victoria was too absorbed in finding the perfect angle for her photos to notice me. She leaned against the polished hood of the Porsche, tilting her head and flashing a brilliant empty smile at her phone screen. It was Lucas who saw me first. He stepped out of the 3-car garage, wiping his hands on a pristine white towel. He was wearing a casual weekend outfit that probably cost more than my first truck. He had a relaxed, arrogant smile on his face, but that smile vanished the absolute second his eyes locked onto mine. His posture stiffened. The towel in his hands suddenly stopped moving. I did not rush. I did not yell. In 40 years of running a logistics empire, dealing with corrupt vendors and striking dock workers, I learned one universal truth. A quiet, controlled presence is far more terrifying than a man who screams. I stopped a few feet away from him. Victoria finally looked up, lowering her phone with a look of mild annoyance that quickly shifted to forced surprise. I reached into my intercoat pocket and pulled out the folded bank statement. I held it out to my son. I did not say a word. I just waited. Lucas hesitated for a bare second before taking the paper. His eyes scanned the black and white ink, the routing numbers, the clear endorsement stamp from the luxury auto group. I watched the blood drain completely from his face. His skin turned a pale, sickly shade of gray. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "Dad." He started, his voice cracking slightly. "I can explain this. This is not what it looks like." I kept my hands comfortably in my pockets. "It looks exactly like what it is, Lucas. It looks like $150,000 money that was supposed to secure a safe ground floor home for your dying mother was just handed over to a luxury car dealership. So please, explain it to me. Make it make sense." Lucas wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. His mind was racing, trying to construct a bridge over a burning chasm. He took a deep breath, and the panic in his eyes was suddenly replaced by a look of earnest, practiced professionalism. It was a mask I had seen him wear during corporate board meetings. "The condo fell through, Dad," he said quickly, handing the paper back to me. During the final title search, the escrow company found a massive hidden lien on the property from a previous owner. It was a legal nightmare. If I had left your money in that escrow account, it could have been frozen in litigation for years. I had to pull the funds immediately to protect your cash. I stared at him. It was a brilliant lie. It used real estate terminology, it played on my desire to protect my assets, and it framed him as the savior of the situation. But a lien does not force a buyer to endorse a cashier's check to a Porsche dealership. I waited for him to finish the bridge. I had the cash in hand. Lucas continued, his voice gaining confidence. And right at that moment, Victoria got the call. She landed the executive director position at the Sterling brokerage downtown. "Dad, they deal in $10 million estates. She is going to be securing VIP clients, athletes, and foreign investors. But in that world, optics are everything. If she pulls up to a luxury mansion in a used sedan, they will not even let her in the gate. She needed a closer's car." Victoria, sensing her cue perfectly, stepped away from the Porsche and walked toward us. The Instagram model vanished instantly, replaced by the devoted, hard-working daughter-in-law. Her eyes widened with manufactured concern. She quickly wiped a non-existent tear from her cheek. "Richard," she said, using my first name with a soft, trembling voice. "I am so sorry we did not call you first. Everything just happened so fast. I did not want to use your money, but Lucas insisted it was an investment in our family's future." "An investment," I repeated flatly. "Yes, Dad." Lucas jumped in. "Her first commission check next month will be over $200,000. I am going to return your entire $150,000 plus 10% interest. And then we will find a much better condo for Mom. One with a private garden, I promise you. We just needed to leverage the cash for 30 days to launch her new career." Victoria reached out and gently touched my arm. Her acrylic nails tapped against my jacket. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "I am grinding myself to the bone for this family, Richard. I swear to you. I want to land these massive accounts for one reason only. I want to pay for Patty's experimental treatments. I want to send her to that specialized clinic in Switzerland you were reading about. I love her like my own mother. I am doing this for her." She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around my shoulders in a tight hug. As she pressed against me, the heavy scent of her expensive perfume filled my nose, mixing with the smell of fresh tire wax from the SUV behind her. Then, as if remembering a prop in a stage play, she pulled away and gestured to a canvas tote bag resting on the hood of the car. Oh, I almost forgot. I woke up at 5 this morning to make this. She reached into the bag and pulled out a large stainless steel thermos. It is a homemade herbal soup. My grandmother used to make it for people who were weak. It is packed with natural antioxidants. I was just about to drive to the hospital to drop it off for Patty. Please take it to her. Tell her I am praying for her every single hour. I took the heavy thermos from her hands. The metal was warm. I looked at the thermos, then at the shiny new Porsche, and finally at my son. Lucas was standing tall now, looking at me with the absolute confidence of a man who believed he had just successfully conned an old fool. In my mind, 1,000 alarms were ringing. I knew that pulling funds from an escrow account requires signing a release form, which I had not done. I knew that luxury cars lose 20% of their value the second they are driven off the lot, making them the worst possible liquid investment. I knew they were lying through their teeth. But if I exploded right there, if I demanded my money back and threatened legal action, they would just secure a bank loan against the car, pay me back, and I would never truly know the depth of their deception. I needed to see exactly how far they were willing to go. I needed them to feel completely safe. I softened the muscles in my face. I let my shoulders drop, adopting the posture of a tired, overwhelmed husband who was just relieved that his son was handling things. I understand, Lucas, I said, forcing a weary sigh. I am just so stressed about your mother. Her latest blood tests were terrible. I panicked when I saw the bank statement. I should have trusted you. You are a smart businessman. Just please find her a safe place to live soon. We do not have much time left. Lucas smiled a genuine predatory smile of victory. Do not worry about a thing, Dad. I have everything under control. Tell Mom we love her. I nodded, offering Victoria a small, grateful smile for the thermos. I turned around and began the walk back to my car. I kept my pace slow and unsteady, playing the part of the relieved, trusting father to perfection. I opened my car door, placed the thermos carefully on the passenger seat, and climbed behind the wheel. I started the engine and shifted into gear. As I began to pull away from the curb, I glanced into my side mirror. Victoria had already turned her back, walking toward the driver's side of the Porsche, with her phone raised, immediately resuming her photo shoot. But Lucas was still standing in the driveway. He was not looking at Victoria. He was looking nervously over his shoulder, scanning the street to make sure I was driving away. Satisfied that I was leaving, he reached into the front pocket of his designer jeans. He did not pull out his expensive silver smartphone. He pulled out a thick, cheap, black plastic burner phone, the kind you buy with cash at a convenience store, the kind that cannot be traced. Even from a distance, I could see the sudden, frantic energy in his movements. His thumbs were flying across the small keypad. He was not just sending a text. He was rapidly pushing buttons, navigating menus, and aggressively deleting things. The calm, confident businessman from 2 minutes ago was gone. He looked terrified. A legitimate executive running a family trust does not carry an untraceable burner phone. And he certainly does not stand in his driveway frantically wiping its memory after his father catches him stealing. I drove down the street, the warm thermos of soup resting beside me. My son had not just stolen my money to buy a car. He was hiding something much deeper, something dangerous enough to require a shadow phone. And as I looked at the thermos Victoria had made for my dying wife, a dark, chilling realization washed over me. The rabbit hole was much deeper than a luxury SUV, and I was going to dig until I found the very bottom. The drive to the downtown oncology center was usually a time for me to mentally prepare for the clinical environment, the sterile smells, and the quiet hum of medical machinery. Today, however, my mind was entirely consumed by the heavy stainless steel thermos sitting on the passenger seat. I carried it through the sliding glass doors of the hospital, taking the elevator up to the 4th floor, where my wife was fighting the hardest battle of her life. When I walked into Patty's private room, the sight of her nearly brought me to my knees. Just 3 weeks ago, her oncologist had been cautiously optimistic. Her white blood cell counts were stabilizing, and she had even managed to walk down the hospital corridor unassisted. But over the last 14 days, her condition had inexplicably plummeted. She looked devastatingly frail. Her skin was pale and translucent, stretching tightly over her cheekbones. She was sleeping, her chest rising and falling with shallow, labored breaths. I set the thermos down on the small rolling table beside her bed and pulled up a chair. I took her thin, delicate hand in mine, feeling the prominent veins under her fragile skin. She stirred slightly, opening her tired eyes to look at me. She managed a weak, heartbreaking smile. I kissed her forehead gently, asking how she was feeling today. She whispered that the nausea was overwhelming, a deep, persistent sickness that seemed to radiate from her very bones. She mentioned that she had not been able to keep any solid food down since yesterday afternoon. I looked at the thermos Victoria had packed. The devoted daughter-in-law act played in my head like a poorly scripted movie. Victoria had insisted on preparing these special broths every single morning for the past 2 weeks. She claimed they were an old family recipe packed with antioxidants to help Patty regain her strength. I unscrewed the lid of the thermos. A thick, earthy steam rose from the dark liquid inside. It did not smell like chicken broth or vegetable stew. It had a sharp, bitter, almost medicinal odor that immediately made my stomach turn. I poured a small amount into a plastic hospital cup. The liquid was murky, hiding crushed leaves and dark roots that floated to the surface. Patty looked at the cup, her face contorting in discomfort. She told me softly that the soup always made her feel worse, but she drank it because Victoria went through so much trouble to make it, and she did not want to seem ungrateful to our son's future wife. My chest tightened. A dark, terrifying suspicion began to take root in my mind. The timeline was simply too perfect. Patty's rapid, unexplained decline perfectly coincided with the exact moment Victoria started delivering these daily homemade meals. I thought about the cleared check. I thought about the luxury car sitting in their driveway. I thought about the burner phone Lucas was frantically wiping clean. These were not the actions of innocent, caring people. They were the actions of individuals executing a calculated plan. I placed the lid back on the thermos and tightened it firmly. I told Patty that she did not have to drink it today. I told her I would go down to the cafeteria and get her some simple tea and toast instead. I watched her close her eyes in relief, her exhausted body sinking back into the hospital pillows. I grabbed the thermos and stepped out into the bustling hospital hallway. I did not go to the cafeteria. I walked straight to the staff elevators and rode them down to the research wing. I needed to see Dr. Gregory Hayes. Gregory was not just the lead oncologist managing Patty's case. He was an old friend I had known for 20 years. I found him in his office reviewing patient charts. He looked up surprised to see me outside of Patty's scheduled consultation time. I placed the thermos directly on his desk. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed a massive favor, no questions asked, and completely off the official medical record. I asked him to run a rapid toxicology screen or a mass spectrometry test on the contents of the soup. Gregory frowned, looking from the thermos to my face. He asked if I had a reason to suspect food poisoning or contamination. I told him I suspected something much worse than simple contamination, but I needed scientific proof before I tore my family apart. Because Gregory knew my character, because he knew I was not a man prone to paranoia or irrational panic, he agreed. He took the thermos and walked it down to the pathology lab. I paced the sterile hallway for what felt like an eternity. Every minute dragged on, filled with agonizing thoughts of my wife suffering in her bed. I thought about Lucas, the son I had raised to be an honest man, standing in his driveway, deleting evidence. I thought about Victoria smiling for a camera while clutching the money meant to save my wife. The anger inside me was evolving into something much more dangerous. It was turning into a cold, absolute focus. 45 minutes later, Gregory walked out of the laboratory doors. His face was completely drained of color. He did not invite me back into his office. He pulled me into a quiet, secluded corner of the hallway, away from the passing nurses and orderlies. He handed me a printed lab report, his hands trembling slightly. He looked me dead in the eye and asked exactly who had been feeding this to Patty. I told him it was Victoria, my son's future bride. Gregory lowered his voice to a grave, urgent whisper. He explained that the broth was not a simple vegetable soup. It was highly concentrated with a massive dose of a specific botanical extract called St. John's wort. He explained the pharmacokinetics to me in rapid, terrifying detail. St. John's wort is a powerful enzyme inducer in the liver. When taken in large, concentrated quantities, it forces the liver to rapidly metabolize and flush out complex medications. It was completely neutralizing Patty's chemotherapy. The life-saving drugs were being destroyed in her bloodstream before they could even reach the lymphoma cells. It was actively accelerating the cancer's spread while making her violently ill. The hallway seemed to tilt beneath my feet. The buzzing fluorescent lights above me faded into a dull, distant hum. This was not a tragic medical mistake. This was not a case of negligent alternative medicine. This was intentional, calculated sabotage. Victoria knew exactly what she was brewing. She was deliberately poisoning my wife to speed up her death. She wanted Patty gone before the wedding, removing the only emotional anchor holding my finances together. She wanted the estate, the trusts, and the money, and she was willing to commit murder to get it. I was no longer dealing with a greedy, materialistic child. I was dealing with a ruthless, cold-blooded monster hiding behind a perfect smile. And now, I was going to destroy her. I would never let her win this brutal war. I walked back into Patty's hospital room with a cup of pale, lukewarm chamomile tea. She was still resting, her breathing shallow but steady. I set the tea gently on her bedside table. Then I picked up the heavy stainless steel thermos. I carried it into her private bathroom and poured the dark, toxic broth directly down the sink. I watched the murky liquid swirl and vanish, taking with it the physical evidence of my daughter-in-law's monstrous intentions. I rinsed the thermos thoroughly with scalding hot water, leaving absolutely no trace of the poison inside. I could have screamed. I could have stormed out of that hospital, driven straight to Victoria's real estate firm, and dragged her out by her hair. But rage is a luxury a man in my position simply cannot afford. Rage makes you sloppy. Rage makes you predictable. And I needed to be entirely unpredictable. Leaving the clean thermos on the counter, I walked out to the nurses' station. I asked to speak directly with the hospital administrator. I did not give them the full story, as a formal investigation would alert Victoria before I was ready. Instead, I used the one language every private hospital understands perfectly. I pulled out my checkbook. I hired 3 private, thoroughly vetted, registered nurses to stand guard over my wife on rotating 8-hour shifts. I issued a strict zero-tolerance directive. No outside food or beverages were to be given to Patty under any circumstances. Furthermore, Victoria was absolutely forbidden from entering the room unless I was physically present. The hospital staff agreed immediately. My wife was finally secure. With Patty protected, I walked out of the hospital and got back into my car. I checked the gold watch on my wrist. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I knew Lucas and Victoria's schedule perfectly because Victoria had complained endlessly about it on social media. They were currently across town at an exclusive catering company in the West Loop, spending 3 hours tasting truffle-infused appetizers and imported champagne for their lavish wedding reception. They would be thoroughly distracted and completely unreachable. I drove directly to their upscale neighborhood. The streets were quiet, bathed in the soft afternoon sunlight. I parked my car 2 blocks away to avoid drawing any attention from their nosy neighbors. I walked down the sidewalk with a calm, measured pace. When I reached their front door, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the emergency spare key Lucas had given me months ago. He had handed it to me with a grand speech about how his home was always my home. It was a hollow gesture, but today it was my greatest advantage. The lock turned with a smooth, quiet click. I stepped inside and gently closed the solid oak door behind me. The house was immaculate, silent, and smelling faintly of expensive vanilla diffusers. I did not linger in the foyer or the custom kitchen I had paid for. I moved purposefully down the hallway and pushed open the double doors leading into my son's private home office. The room was a monument to unearned arrogance. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the space, surrounded by leather chairs and shelves filled with unread business books. I stepped behind the desk and began my search. I was looking for the cheap black plastic burner phone I had seen Lucas frantically wiping in the driveway. A man hiding a secondary phone does not carry it into a high-profile wedding tasting with his demanding fiancée. He leaves it somewhere safe, somewhere he assumes no one will ever look. I started with the obvious hiding spots. I opened the desk drawers one by one, sifting through neatly organized files, luxury pens, and blank stationery. I found nothing. I moved to the bookshelves, running my hands behind the leather-bound volumes. Nothing. I checked the pockets of the spare suit jackets hanging in the closet. Still nothing. The clock was ticking, and my window of opportunity was slowly closing. I stood in the center of the room, closed my eyes, and put myself in my son's shoes. Where does a coward hide his most dangerous secrets? I walked back to the heavy mahogany desk. I knelt on the plush carpet and slid myself underneath the knee-hole. I reached my hand up, feeling along the rough, unfinished underside of the central drawer. My fingers brushed past the wood and snagged on something thick and synthetic. It was a strip of heavy-duty duct tape. My heart gave a hard, rhythmic thud against my ribs. I peeled the tape back slowly, wincing at the harsh ripping sound it made in the quiet room. A small black rectangular object dropped directly into the palm of my hand. It was the burner phone. I slid out from under the desk and stood up, holding the device up to the light. It was cheap light and completely devoid of any identifying marks. I pressed the power button on the side. The small screen lit up with a dull glow, immediately demanding a 4-digit numerical passcode. I stared at the lock screen. I knew my son. Despite his newfound arrogance and his polished corporate facade, Lucas was fundamentally unoriginal. He relied on patterns. I typed in his birth year. Incorrect. I typed in Victoria's birth year. Incorrect. I tried the anniversary of the day they bought the house. Incorrect. A small warning flashed on the screen indicating I only had 2 attempts left before the device locked permanently. I paused, thinking back to the boy he used to be before greed consumed him. I remembered the golden retriever we bought for him when he was 10 years old. He had loved that dog more than anything in the world. He named the dog Buster. I looked at the numerical keypad. The letters for Buster corresponded to the numbers 2, 8, 7, and 8. I typed in 2878. The screen blinked, the lock icon shattered, and the home screen loaded perfectly. My hands were completely steady as I navigated the crude menu interface. There were no text messages, no contact names, and no browsing history. Lucas had indeed wiped the visible data clean, but cowards are often careless when they panic. He had cleared the text threads, but he had completely forgotten to check the deleted voicemails folder. I opened the phone application, navigated to the voicemail tab, and found a single recently recovered audio file resting in the inbox. It was received just 2 days ago. I pressed play and raised the small speaker to my ear. Victoria's voice filled the office. She did not sound like the sweet daughter-in-law who had hugged me. Her tone was sharp, vicious, and impatient. "Tell the doctor to sign the terminal prognosis already. If the old lady doesn't die before the wedding, we can't use the grieving family excuse to make your dad transfer the commercial collateral into the joint trust." I stood frozen. The voicemail ended with a harsh beep. It was all a calculated lie. Now I knew the truth. Commercial collateral. Those 2 words echoed in the silence of my son's office, ringing in my ears like a death knell. The phrase hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the breath completely out of my lungs. I stood perfectly still, letting the heavy, suffocating weight of my daughter-in-law's recorded voice wash over me. She was not just plotting to inherit my wealth after my wife passed away. She was actively manipulating the timeline of Patty's death to seize control of my commercial assets before I could realize what was happening. I placed the cheap plastic phone back exactly where I had found it. I pressed the strip of thick tape firmly against the underside of the mahogany desk, making sure it looked entirely undisturbed. I smoothed out the fibers of the carpet where I had knelt, erasing every trace of my presence. I walked out of the office, stepping softly down the hallway, and slipped out the front door. The afternoon air was still warm, but I felt a freezing chill settling deep into my bones. I walked back to my car, got behind the wheel, and sat in the heavy silence. Commercial collateral. I turned the ignition, gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned entirely white. I did not drive back to the hospital. I navigated my car toward the towering steel and glass skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. I needed to see Thomas Gallagher. Thomas was my corporate attorney, a ruthless, brilliant legal mind who had protected my business interests for over 3 decades. He was not a man who dealt in emotions or family drama. He dealt in facts, contracts, and cold legal warfare. The drive took less than 40 minutes, but my mind raced through 1,000 different scenarios. I pulled into the underground parking garage of his firm, bypassed the main reception desk entirely, and walked straight into his corner office. Thomas looked up from a stack of legal briefs, his sharp blue eyes instantly registering the grim expression on my face. He put his pen down and asked me what was wrong. I closed his heavy wooden door, shutting out the noise of his busy firm. I sat down in the leather chair across from his desk. I told him I needed him to pull the county property records for my retirement assets immediately. I told him I suspected my son and his future wife were maneuvering to steal my properties. Thomas did not waste time asking unnecessary questions. He turned his attention to his dual computer monitors and immediately logged into the secure county real estate database. To understand the gravity of my panic, you have to understand what my commercial collateral actually meant. Over 30 years ago, long before the logistics industry shifted to modern distribution centers, I purchased a massive rundown commercial warehouse district in the industrial sector of Chicago. I bought the land for almost nothing, spent a decade renovating the structures, and turned them into premium leasing spaces for high-end corporate tenants. Those warehouses were my absolute masterpiece. They were the crowning achievement of my life's work. More importantly, they were the financial bedrock of my retirement. They generated a steady, untouchable stream of passive income that ensured Patty would always have access to the best private medical care in the world, no matter how long her battle with cancer lasted. I had purposely placed those commercial properties into an ironclad trust specifically structured so that they could not be sold, leveraged, or mortgaged without my direct in-person authorization. I had designed it to be completely impenetrable. But as Thomas typed furiously on his keyboard, searching through the digital archives of the county recorder, a heavy sinking dread pooled in my stomach. The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the rapid clicking of his mouse. 5 minutes passed. Then 10 minutes. I watched his face closely. Thomas was a man who rarely showed any emotion. He had defended multi-million-dollar lawsuits with a completely blank expression. But as he opened a specific digital file on his screen, his jaw tightened. The color slowly drained from his cheeks. He stopped typing. He leaned closer to the monitor, reading the document line by line, as if he could not quite believe what his own eyes were seeing. He let out a long, heavy breath and took off his glasses. He looked across the desk at me, his expression grave and deeply troubled. He asked me if I had visited a downtown bank branch at any point in the last 90 days to authorize a massive loan. I told him I had not stepped foot inside a commercial lending office in over 5 years. I asked him what he had found. Thomas rotated his large flat-screen monitor so it directly faced me. He pointed to a scanned legal document displayed brightly on the screen. It was a commercial deed of trust, heavily stamped and notarized by a county official just 3 weeks ago. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as the horrifying reality of the document became clear. Someone had used my commercial warehouse district as collateral to secure a massive high-interest cash loan. The total amount borrowed against my life's work was $2,500,000. I stared at the bottom of the final page. There, sitting clearly above the printed line of my legal name, was my signature. It was a masterful forgery. It mimicked the exact loops and sharp angles of my handwriting, but I knew with absolute certainty that I had never held a pen to that paper. Thomas pointed to the receiving party listed on the loan disbursement details. The $2,500,000 had not been transferred into any account belonging to my son. Instead, the entire fortune had been funneled directly into an obscure holding company. It was a newly registered shell corporation. Thomas clicked on another tab, pulling up the state business registration for the holding company. He highlighted the name of the sole managing director. It was Victoria Kensington. My daughter-in-law had forged my signature to quietly extract $2.5 million of pure cash from my commercial estate. She had used my son's access to my private records to bypass the security measures of my trust. They were not just waiting for my wife to die so they could inherit my wealth. They were actively bleeding me dry right now, stealing my retirement funds from right under my nose to fund their lavish lifestyle, while feeding Patty a toxic broth to ensure she would not survive to see them exposed. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought I was a naive, grieving old man who would simply fade away in the background. But looking at that forged signature, my sorrow completely vanished, leaving only a cold, devastating desire for absolute destruction. I looked at Thomas and told him to lock the office door. We had a brutal war to plan, and I intended to win. Thomas walked over to the heavy oak door of his corner office and turned the brass lock. The sharp click echoed in the quiet space, sealing us in. He walked briskly back to his desk, grabbed his phone, and immediately pulled up his contact list. He told me he was calling his direct contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He explained with intense clinical precision that bank fraud and the forgery of commercial collateral documents were severe federal offenses. He wanted to contact the United States Attorney's Office right now, freeze the associated accounts, and have Lucas and Victoria detained before they could move the stolen money offshore or try to cover their digital tracks. He was already preparing to treat this as a major corporate crime, moving with the swift aggression of a man who handled high-stakes litigation for a living. I raised my hand silently, commanding him to put the phone down. I told him we were not calling the authorities. Not yet. Thomas froze, looking at me as if I had completely lost my mind. He leaned across the wide mahogany desk and reminded me that every passing hour gave them time to drain those funds. He warned me that if the originating bank discovered the forgery before we reported it, I would have to endure a grueling, invasive legal battle to prove I was not complicit in my own son's criminal scheme. I looked him directly in the eyes and explained my reasoning. I knew my son, and I knew the woman who was currently manipulating him. If the federal agents knocked on their door today, Victoria would instantly play the victim. She would cry, hire a high-priced defense attorney using my stolen money, and claim that a rogue mortgage broker had handled all the complex paperwork. Lucas would likely claim that we had a verbal agreement, twisting my willingness to help them buy a medical condo for Patty into a vague, overarching authorization for this massive commercial loan. They would drag my dying wife through months of painful depositions and court hearings. They would delay, obfuscate, and point fingers. They might even try to settle out of court, preserving their reputations, their freedom, and their social standing. I told Thomas I did not want a messy, prolonged legal battle. I wanted absolute, undeniable destruction. I wanted a trap so flawless and so devastating that they would not even see the steel jaws closing around them until it was entirely too late. Thomas slowly lowered his phone, returning it to its cradle. He sat back in his high-backed leather chair, studying my face with a mixture of professional concern and deep understanding. He had known me for 30 years. He had watched me build my logistics empire, and he recognized the cold, flat tone in my voice. It was the exact same tone I used when I ruthlessly dismantled my biggest corporate competitors. He steepled his fingers and asked me exactly what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted to become their absolute worst nightmare. I asked him how we could legally take complete control of their financial throats, bypassing the slow, merciful grind of the federal justice system. Thomas remained silent for a long time. He tapped his expensive silver pen against a legal pad, his brilliant mind racing through the complex labyrinth of United States financial law. Then a slow, dark smile crept across his face. He leaned forward and asked me how much liquid capital I currently had access to outside of my primary family trusts. I told him I had a substantial amount in secure cash reserves, far more than the $2.5 million they had just stolen from my commercial estate. He laid out a strategy that was as brutal as it was elegant. He explained that commercial loans, unlike standard residential mortgages, are frequently bought and sold on the secondary market. Banks do not necessarily want to hold on to the long-term risk of a commercial note. They originate the loan, collect the lucrative initial processing fees, and often sell the debt to private equity firms, hedge funds, or other financial institutions to quickly clear their balance sheets. Thomas proposed that we set up a blind offshore trust, an anonymous corporate entity completely shielded by impenetrable layers of legal privacy. Through this anonymous trust, we would approach the originating bank tomorrow morning. We would offer to purchase the promissory note and the deed of trust for the $2.5 million loan. We would offer a slight premium above the principal value to ensure the bank accepted the deal immediately without asking unnecessary questions. The sheer brilliance of the plan washed over me, replacing my grief with a surge of adrenaline. I authorized him to move forward instantly. I instructed him to drain my secondary accounts, set up the holding company, in whatever jurisdiction offered the most absolute secrecy, and buy the paper. I did not care about the premium cost. I did not care about the exorbitant legal fees required to expedite the process. I wanted to own that debt. Thomas began pulling up the standard boilerplate contracts used by the specific lending institution Lucas and Victoria had defrauded. He explained the profound danger of commercial borrowing, a danger my arrogant daughter-in-law clearly did not comprehend. Commercial loans are governed by extremely strict, unforgiving covenants. They are designed to ruthlessly protect the lender at all costs. Thomas pointed to a specific paragraph deep within the dense legal text on his monitor. It was the acceleration clause. He explained that under standard commercial loan agreements, if the lender discovers any form of material misrepresentation, fraud, or forgery, in the origination documents, the entire loan is classified as being in immediate incurable default. The lender does not have to wait for missed monthly payments. They do not have to endure a lengthy foreclosure process or issue polite warnings. The acceleration clause allows the creditor to call the entire note due immediately. The full balance, every single cent of the $2.5 million plus penalties and interest must be paid back within 24 hours. If the borrower cannot produce the cash, the creditor has the absolute legal right to instantly seize the collateral, freeze the associated assets, and refer the fraudulent documentation directly to federal prosecutors for immediate indictment. The beautiful, poetic irony of the situation settled deep into my chest. Lucas thought his expensive business degree made him invincible. Victoria thought her ruthless social climbing made her untouchable. They believed they had committed the perfect, untraceable crime. They believed they had stolen from a massive, faceless banking institution that would take months, maybe years, to notice a forged signature deep in their archives. They thought they were securely funding a lavish future while they fed my wife poison and waited for her to quietly pass away. They had absolutely no idea that within 48 hours, the anonymous entity holding the power to utterly destroy their lives would be me. I stood up from the leather guest chair. I told Thomas to get the paperwork started and to not sleep until the offshore trust was officially established and the debt was purchased in full. He nodded, his fingers already flying across his keyboard, drafting the preliminary legal frameworks. I walked out of the towering glass skyscraper and stepped into the cool Chicago evening. I looked up at the city lights, feeling a profound sense of clarity. By purchasing that loan, I was officially stepping into the shadows. I was now their sole creditor, their silent financial executioner. They had tried to rob a bank, but they had unwittingly sold their souls to the very man they were trying to ruin. And I fully intended to let them celebrate their supposed victory, letting them climb to the absolute height of their arrogance before I triggered that acceleration clause and watched their entire world burn to ash. I drove slowly home from Thomas Gallagher's office, feeling a strange, hollow calmness. The frantic panic from earlier was completely gone, replaced by the cold precision of a man arming a bomb. I had the offshore trust established. I was the silent owner of their fraudulent debt. Now I needed to make absolutely sure they felt invincible. I needed them to believe their cruel plan was working flawlessly. The absolute most dangerous enemy is the one who convinces you he has already surrendered. I dialed my son's number. Lucas answered quickly, his voice guarded clearly, expecting another angry confrontation about the luxury car. Instead of anger, I injected my voice with deep, trembling exhaustion. I played the broken, grieving husband who had no fight left. I apologized for my harsh words in the driveway. I told him Patty's health was failing rapidly. The doctors were out of answers, and the sheer stress of losing her had made me irrational. I asked if he and Victoria would please come over for dinner that evening. I wanted to make amends and focus on our family, while we still had time. Lucas sighed with relief. He agreed, his tone shifting back to the patronizing son who believed he was in control. I spent 2 hours preparing a simple meal. I roasted a chicken and set the dining room table. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath and let my posture sag. I opened the door to find Lucas and Victoria on my porch. Victoria wore a white sundress holding a small bouquet of lilies. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around my neck. She murmured empty words of sympathy, telling me how heavily my pain weighed on her heart. Her floral perfume was nauseating, but I forced myself to return the embrace with the clumsy affection of a clueless elder. We moved into the dining room. I served the meal, keeping my hands unsteady to sell the illusion of my deteriorating state. Throughout the meal, I kept the conversation focused on my wife's condition. I described Patty's sudden weakness, her inability to keep food down, and the terrible feeling that the end was drawing near. I watched them closely from across the table. They put on a masterful performance. Lucas nodded solemnly, staring at his plate with manufactured grief. Victoria reached across the oak table, placing her hand over mine. She squeezed my fingers, telling me we had to be strong, that Patty would want us to celebrate life, and their upcoming wedding would bring a ray of light into this dark season. I listened to her venomous words and nodded, forcing a tired smile. I withdrew my hand and reached into my cardigan pocket. I told them thinking about their wedding made me realize how foolishly I had acted. I explained that in my profound grief, I had lost sight of the future. I told Lucas that I understood why he had purchased the luxury vehicle that an executive in Victoria's new high-profile position needed to project success, and that I was wrong to question his financial judgment. I watched the tension completely drain from my son's shoulders. The last lingering shadows of worry vanished from his face, replaced by a glowing, arrogant satisfaction. He actually leaned back in his chair and took a long, triumphant sip of his red wine. I pulled a folded piece of crisp paper from my pocket and smoothed it out on the table. It was a cashier's check, drafted from one of my personal accounts, made out directly to Victoria Kensington. The amount printed clearly on the face of the check was $150,000. I slid the paper across the smooth wooden surface toward my future daughter-in-law. I told her that I wanted to replace the funds Lucas had borrowed. I told her that this money was my official wedding gift to them, a gesture of absolute faith in their new life together. I insisted that she use it to cover the lavish catering, the imported flowers, and every single detail she had dreamed of for her special day. I looked at her with wide, trusting eyes and said that I simply wanted to see my family happy before the darkness took my wife away. Victoria stared at the heavy black ink on the cashier's check. For a fraction of a second, the sweet, concerned mask slipped entirely. Her eyes widened, flashing, with a raw, ravenous hunger that made my stomach turn. It was the look of a predator staring at an exposed throat. She quickly recovered, pressing her hand over her heart and letting out a soft, theatrical gasp of disbelief. She stood up from her chair, rushed around the table, and threw her arms around me. She thanked me profusely, her voice vibrating with a sickening, manufactured joy. She swore that this generous gift would make their wedding the most beautiful day of their lives, and that she would honor our family name forever. She pulled away and walked back around the table, picking up the check with a delicate, possessive grace. She folded the thick paper carefully and slipped it into her designer handbag. She sat back down next to Lucas. My son smiled at me, a lazy, victorious grin, telling me that I had done the right thing and that everything was going to be perfectly fine. I nodded, keeping my expression perfectly blank, playing the role of the defeated, generous father to the very end. As I stood up from the table to gather the empty dinner plates, I turned my back to them, moving slowly toward the kitchen archway. I kept my footsteps heavy and shuffling, making it seem as though all my energy was gone. I was barely 5 feet away from them, partially obscured by the shadows of the hallway, when Victoria leaned to her left. She tilted her head close to my son's shoulder. She believed I was out of earshot. She believed I was too consumed by my own manufactured sorrow to pay any attention to the world around me. But the house was quiet, and my hearing was perfectly fine. Her voice dropped to a sharp, venomous whisper, barely louder than a breath, but every single syllable cut through the silence of the dining room with absolute clarity. She smirked, a triumphant, greedy expression twisting her features. I told you the old fool was too distracted to notice the warehouse. I stopped walking. My hands tightened around the dirty dinner plates. I did not move a muscle. I did not gasp or show any physical sign that her words had struck me. I stood there in the shadows, letting the absolute, undeniable confirmation of their treachery wash over me. She had just confessed. She had just handed me the final damning piece of the puzzle. I took a deep, silent breath, feeling a cold, dark satisfaction spreading through my chest. They thought they had won. They thought I was blind, broken, and beaten. But the trap was fully set, the steel jaws were wide open, and they had just gleefully stepped right onto the trigger. 3 weeks remained until the wedding. Against all medical advice and my own desperate pleas, Victoria insisted that Patty absolutely had to attend her final bridal fitting. She framed it as a beautiful gesture, a way to honor her future mother-in-law, claiming that having Patty there would make the day complete. It was a beautiful lie, perfectly designed to make Victoria look like an angel to her friends. Patty, despite her profound exhaustion and the nausea that still clung to her every morning, agreed. She wanted to preserve the peace. She wanted to see her son happy. Her hair had completely fallen out during the second round of intensive chemotherapy, so she spent an hour that morning carefully arranging a beautiful chestnut wig on her head. She applied a light touch of blush to her pale cheeks, trying her hardest to look healthy, to look normal for a celebration that she was barely strong enough to attend. I drove us to the exclusive bridal boutique downtown, carefully helping her out of the passenger seat and settling her gently into her folding wheelchair. The boutique was a massive, glittering sanctuary of white silk mirrored walls and crystal chandeliers. It smelled of expensive champagne and fresh orchids. When I pushed Patty through the heavy glass doors, Victoria was already standing on a raised circular pedestal surrounded by 4 of her bridesmaids. She was draped in layers of imported lace and sparkling beadwork. As we approached, the bright, welcoming smile she wore for her friends faltered for a fraction of a second. She looked down at Patty, then specifically at the wheelchair, her eyes narrowing with distinct irritation. She immediately gestured to one of the boutique assistants, loudly whispering that the bulky metal chair was completely ruining the aesthetic of the viewing area and blocking the natural lighting for the photographer she had hired to document the fitting. She forced me to wheel Patty into a cramped, dim corner next to a rack of heavy velvet curtains, effectively pushing my wife out of the way like an inconvenient piece of luggage. Patty kept her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor, pretending she had not heard a single word. For the next hour, Victoria paraded around the boutique. She treated my wife entirely like a stage prop. Whenever the photographer needed a touching family moment, Victoria would suddenly rush over to the dark corner, crouch down beside the wheelchair, and flash a brilliant, teary-eyed smile, resting her chin delicately against the frail shoulder of Patty. The absolute second the camera shutter clicked, the smile vanished. Victoria would instantly stand up, dust off her dress, and walk away without saying a single comforting word to the woman fighting for her life. Lucas arrived halfway through the appointment. He walked in carrying a tray of iced coffees for the bridesmaids, completely ignoring his mother as he handed the drinks out. He stood near the pedestal, admiring his future bride, soaking in the attention and the luxury that was entirely funded by my stolen money. The final blow came when Victoria stepped off the pedestal to examine her veil in a full-length mirror. Patty, attempting to participate in the moment, offered a quiet, genuine compliment about how beautifully the lace framed the face of Victoria. Victoria turned around, her expression hardening into a look of absolute disgust. She did not say thank you. Instead, she let out a sharp, dramatic sigh and crossed her arms. She looked directly at the chestnut wig, raising her voice so that every single bridesmaid and boutique employee in the room could hear her perfectly. She stated that the dark hair color clashed terribly with the pastel theme of the wedding photos. She complained that the wig looked incredibly cheap and synthetic, adding that having such a depressing, sickly-looking accessory in the background of her pristine bridal portraits was going to completely ruin the visual balance she had worked so hard to create. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. The bridesmaids exchanged knowing glances, a few of them hiding small, cruel snickers behind their champagne glasses. Patty physically shrank back into her wheelchair. She reached up with a trembling, paper-thin hand and pulled the edges of her cardigan tighter around her chest, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. A single tear escaped her eye, tracking a slow path down her pale cheek. She did not say a word in her own defense. She simply lowered her head, accepting the brutal humiliation to keep the peace for her son. I stood roughly 10 feet away, leaning casually against a display table. 2 weeks ago, I would have thrown the table across the room. I would have shattered the mirrors, dragged my son by his collar, and screamed until my voice gave out. But today, I did not rage. I did not move. I kept my face perfectly slack, adopting the vacant, exhausted stare of a man who was simply too old and too tired to intervene. But my hands were not resting idly. Inside the deep pocket of my coat, my fingers were curled tightly around my smartphone. The camera lens was positioned perfectly through a small gap in the fabric, and the voice recorder was active. I was capturing every single second of the cruelty. I was documenting every vicious word, every sneer, and every tear my wife shed. But the true revelation of that afternoon was not the narcissism. It was Lucas. I shifted my gaze away from my weeping wife and looked directly at my son. Lucas had heard every word his bride had just said. He had seen his mother shrink in absolute shame. He saw the tears falling down her fragile face. For one brief, fleeting second, I saw a flicker of discomfort cross his features. He knew it was wrong. He knew it was monstrous. But instead of stepping forward, instead of defending the woman who had given him life, who had stayed up with him through childhood fevers and sacrificed her own dreams to build his future, Lucas simply turned his head. He looked away, staring blankly at a rack of silk gowns, choosing the comfort of his stolen wealth and his cruel bride over the dignity of his dying mother. He made a conscious, deliberate choice to let her suffer. In that precise moment, standing in that bright, fragrant boutique, a profound and permanent shift occurred within me. Any lingering trace of doubt, any desperate, foolish hope that my son was just a misguided victim of manipulation completely evaporated. The invisible thread that connects a father to his child simply snapped. My paternal love died right there on the polished hardwood floor, replaced by a cold, impenetrable void. They were no longer family. They were parasites, and I was going to exterminate them completely and thoroughly, leaving absolutely nothing behind. I was going to take everything they valued, everything they thought they owned, and crush it into dust before their very eyes. They wanted a wedding, and I would give them a nightmare. To wait was essential. To wait was essential. But waiting did not mean sitting idle. I gently pushed Patty's wheelchair out of the glaring light of the bridal boutique, carefully guiding her toward the exit. Victoria was far too absorbed in admiring her reflection to notice us leaving. Lucas did not follow us out. He did not offer to help his mother into the car. He stayed behind, enveloped entirely in the shallow world he had chosen over his own flesh and blood. I helped Patty into the passenger seat, buckling her in with care. The drive home was quiet. She leaned her head against the cool glass, her eyes closed, exhausted by the physical toll of the afternoon. I simply drove my hands gripping the steering wheel with calculated resolve. Once we arrived at the house, I handed her care over to the private nurses. I made certain she was resting comfortably in bed before I walked back out to my car. My grief had burned away, leaving a brilliant focus in its place. I navigated through the dense afternoon traffic, heading straight back to the towering steel building where Thomas Gallagher commanded his legal empire. I bypassed the receptionist, striding down the carpeted hallway with a singular, relentless purpose. When I opened the heavy oak door to his corner office, Thomas was already waiting for me. He was standing by the window looking out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. He turned as I entered, his sharp features illuminated by the sun. He gestured to the leather chair across from his desk. I sat down, the silence between us heavy with anticipation. Thomas did not offer pleasantries. He knew exactly why I was there. He walked over to his desk and picked up a thick, meticulously organized file folder. He sat down in his chair, folding his hands over the cover. He looked at me with an expression of profound, professional satisfaction. He announced that the transaction was officially complete. The blind offshore trust had been successfully established under impenetrable layers of privacy. Through that anonymous entity, we had aggressively approached the originating bank. Seduced by the premium buyout offer we presented, the bank had eagerly sold the commercial debt to clear their risk ledger. Thomas slid the folder across the mahogany surface. He told me that I was now the sole undisputed holder of the promissory note. The $2.5 million loan secured against my commercial warehouse district was mine. I was no longer the victim of a fraudulent scheme. I was the shadow creditor holding absolute power of financial life and death over my son and his future bride. I placed my hand on the cool leather folder, feeling the immense weight of the leverage I now possessed. I asked Thomas what he had found regarding the money trail. I needed to know exactly where that $2.5 million had gone. Thomas pulled out a secondary file from his desk drawer, his jaw tightening with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. He explained that forensic accountants had traced the funds from the moment the bank dispersed the cash. The money had not stayed in the initial shell corporation Victoria established. It had been immediately transferred through a complex web of secondary holding companies designed to obscure the final destination. But Thomas and his team had relentlessly pierced the corporate veil. He handed me a high-resolution photograph printed on glossy paper. It showed a sprawling, ultra-modern luxury mansion nestled into a pristine snow-capped mountainside. Thomas explained that Victoria and Lucas had used the stolen funds to purchase this unlisted exclusive property in Aspen, California. The entire transaction was executed in cash through the final layer of Victoria's corporate shell game. They had bought a spectacular winter retreat, fully furnished with imported Italian leather and custom artwork, while actively complaining about the cost of my wife's medical treatments. They were planning to spend winters sipping champagne in a multi-million-dollar ski lodge funded entirely by my forged signature and my impending grief. The sheer audacity of their greed was staggering. They had not just stolen my money. They arrogantly assumed I would be far too destroyed by Patty's death to notice the missing collateral. Thomas leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, serious timbre. He told me that we now possessed everything we needed to utterly obliterate them. He outlined the legal mechanisms with cold, surgical precision. He explained that because the initial commercial loan was obtained using a forged signature on federal bank documents, it constituted severe, undeniable bank fraud. Under the strict legal framework of the promissory note, I controlled any instance of material fraud automatically and irrevocably triggered the acceleration clause. He opened a separate document, a series of legal notices printed on heavy watermarked paper. He pointed to the bold, uncompromising text. By triggering the acceleration clause, the entire $2.5 million debt was instantly due. There would be no grace period. There would be no opportunity to restructure payments or negotiate a settlement. Once the default notices were served, Lucas and Victoria would have exactly 24 hours to produce the full amount in cash. If they failed to deliver the funds to the blind trust by the deadline, I had absolute legal authority to seize the Aspen mansion, freeze every bank account tied to their names, and immediately refer the dossier of forged documents directly to federal authorities for criminal prosecution. They believed they were untouchable. They believed they had committed the perfect crime against a helpless old man. They had no idea that they now owed their stolen millions directly to me, and that their freedom was hanging by a single fraying thread. The plan was completely flawless. It was a perfect, inescapable snare designed to crush their arrogance and strip away every illusion of control they possessed. I looked at the legal documents, visualizing the exact moment their smug, self-satisfied smiles would shatter into pure, unadulterated terror. They treated my dying wife like an ugly inconvenience. They plotted to steal my life's work. They poisoned the woman who gave my son life. And now they were going to pay the ultimate price. Thomas carefully gathered the default notices and the acceleration demands, sliding them into a large manila envelope. He sealed the flap with slow, deliberate precision. He stood up from his leather chair and walked around the massive mahogany desk, stopping directly in front of me. The late afternoon shadows were beginning to stretch across the polished office floor, casting a dark, ominous atmosphere over the quiet room. He held the thick envelope out to me, his sharp blue eyes locking onto mine with an unspoken understanding of the total devastation it contained. He asked me a single pivotal question. He asked me exactly when I wanted to serve them with the documents. I stood up and took the heavy envelope from his waiting hands. I looked out the window at the fading city light, feeling a profound, chilling calmness settle deeply into my very soul. I answered him with absolute certainty. When they have the largest audience possible. The next 3 weeks moved like a ticking time bomb. I maintained my facade of the grieving father funding Victoria's endless demands until the eve of the wedding finally arrived. The rehearsal dinner was held at the exclusive Ridgewood Country Club. Walking into the grand dining hall, the sheer scale of their arrogance was on full display. Massive chandeliers cast a golden glow over tables draped in imported silk. Victoria had spared no expense, confident that her newly acquired millions would cover every lavish detail. I pushed Patty into the room in her wheelchair. She looked incredibly frail, her pale hands resting quietly in her lap, but she insisted on being there. She wanted to see her son on the night before his wedding, completely unaware of the monstrous betrayal he had committed. I parked her chair near the head table, ensuring she was comfortable before I took my seat. It did not take long for Victoria to establish her absolute dominance over the evening. Without my perceived financial oversight to keep her in check, she shed the last remnants of her sweet, dutiful facade. I watched quietly from my chair as she terrorized the country club staff. She snapped her manicured fingers at the waiters, berating a young server to tears because the water was supposedly not chilled to the exact right temperature. She complained that the floral centerpieces obstructed sightlines for the videographer, ordering the exhausted staff to rearrange the heavy vases while guests were trying to sit. She moved through the room with the toxic confidence of a queen surveying her conquered kingdom. She was loud, demanding, and utterly insufferable. She treated the staff serving her like absolute garbage, reveling in the power she felt she had finally secured. While Victoria paraded around the room, basking in her stolen glory, my son presented a drastically different picture. Lucas sat at the center of the head table, but he looked nothing like a happy groom. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. He was sweating through his tailored designer suit. He barely touched the expensive filet mignon on his plate. Instead, he devoted his entire attention to the open bar. I watched him signal the waiter for his fourth glass of neat bourbon before the salads were even cleared. The heavy drinking was a desperate attempt to drown the crushing weight of his guilt. He knew exactly what he had done. He knew the $2.5 million commercial loan he fraudulently secured was a massive federal crime. He knew he had betrayed his father and poisoned his dying mother. Every time I looked in his direction, he immediately snapped his head away, staring down at his polished shoes. He was a coward, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own sins, completely unable to meet my gaze. I sat there calmly chewing my food, offering polite nods to the extended family members who stopped by to offer their hollow sympathies regarding my wife. As the dinner service began to wind down, the clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute cut through the ambient noise of the room. Victoria stood at the head of the table, her face flushed with alcohol and triumph. The room quieted down, turning their attention to the radiant bride. She smiled, holding her glass high. She thanked everyone for coming, delivering a rehearsed speech about love, destiny, and the beautiful journey she and Lucas were about to begin. But then her tone shifted. The sickeningly sweet cadence of her voice took on a sharp, patronizing edge. She turned her body slightly, looking directly at the table where Patty and I were sitting. She took a deep breath and projected her voice so that every single guest in the vast dining hall could hear her perfectly. She stated that marriage was about looking forward, not backward. She declared that it was incredibly important for the older generation to recognize when their time had passed. She raised her glass higher, her eyes locking onto mine, with a vicious, mocking smirk. She proposed a toast to the future, stating that some people simply needed to learn how to let go of the past, step aside, and gladly hand over the reins of power to the youth who truly deserved them. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the audience. Patty looked down at her hands, her shoulders slumping in humiliation. I did not frown. I did not show a single ounce of the cold, lethal rage burning inside my chest. I simply smiled. I reached for my water glass, raised it toward Victoria in a gesture of complete defeated surrender, and took a slow sip. I played the broken, clueless old man to absolute perfection. She had no idea that the reins she thought she was holding were actually wrapped tightly around her own throat. When the dessert course was served, the music grew louder, and the guests began to mingle. I leaned down, kissed Patty gently on the cheek, and told her I needed to step outside to get some fresh air. I navigated through the crowded dining room, slipping quietly out the side doors of the country club. The night air was crisp, a sharp contrast to the suffocating arrogance inside the venue. I walked away from the bright lights of the entrance, moving purposefully toward the far end of the sprawling parking lot. Parked under the dim glow of a solitary street lamp was a sleek black sedan. The engine was completely off, but the silent silhouette of a man was visible in the driver's seat. As I approached, the window rolled down smoothly. My attorney, Thomas Gallagher, looked at me directly from the darkness of the vehicle. His face was entirely devoid of emotion, operating with the clinical detachment of a military commander on the eve of a major offensive. I rested my hands on the edge of the car door and asked him for the final status report. Thomas did not waste a single syllable. He confirmed that the commercial default notices had been fully notarized and the acceleration clause was officially active. He then reached into the passenger seat and held up a thick manila folder. He told me that he had just concluded a private, secure meeting with his direct contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Financial Crimes Unit had reviewed the forged collateral documents and the shell company transfers. The federal agents were fully briefed. Their warrants were signed by a federal judge, and they were officially on standby. Thomas looked me dead in the eye, his voice low and unwavering over the distant sound of the country club music. He stated that the federal authorities were simply waiting for my signal tomorrow afternoon. Everything was in place. The trap was locked. I stood in the quiet shadows of the parking lot, looking back at the glowing windows of the grand dining hall, where my son and his bride were celebrating their stolen fortune. Tomorrow, they would walk down the aisle expecting to secure a lifetime of luxury. Instead, they would be walking directly into a federal penitentiary. The morning of the wedding dawned with a brilliant, cloudless sky casting a deceivingly perfect light over the sprawling green lawns of the elite Chicago Country Club. The air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of thousands of imported white roses, meticulously arranged along every archway and table. It was a monument to greed entirely funded by the stolen $2.5 million. As I helped Patty get ready, the contrast between her physical reality and the impending opulence of the venue was heartbreaking. Despite my desperate pleas, Patty insisted on attending the ceremony. She fought through waves of deep, bone-chilling pain and relentless nausea that left her breathless, but her maternal resolve was unbreakable. She simply wanted to see her only son get married. She wanted to bear witness to the milestone she prayed to see since the day Lucas was born. It took us nearly 2 hours to prepare. I helped her into her emerald green silk dress, which now hung loosely over her frail frame. She sat quietly at her vanity mirror, her trembling hands slowly adjusting the chestnut wig she chose to wear. She applied a delicate layer of makeup, trying to mask the devastating toll the neutralized chemotherapy had taken on her body. She looked at my reflection and offered a weak smile, telling me today was about family, and she would not allow her illness to cast a shadow over her son's happiness. I kissed the top of her head, my heart breaking for the unconditional love currently exploited by the very boy she adored. I transferred her into the folding wheelchair, packed her emergency medical supplies, and loaded us into the car. The drive to the country club was silent, heavy, with the unspoken weight of the secret I was carrying. I parked near the grand entrance, retrieving the wheelchair and settling Patty into the seat. As I pushed her through the towering mahogany doors of the venue, the scale of Victoria's ambitions struck me like a physical blow. The grand ballroom was already packed with over 300 guests, mostly complete strangers. They were Victoria's high society real estate connections, wealthy brokers, luxury developers, and affluent clients she had invited solely to parade her newfound wealth. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated through the crowded and brightly lit room, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of chilled champagne and delicate caviar appetizers. A string quartet played softly from a raised balcony, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the relentless hum of networking and shallow laughter. Everywhere I looked, I saw my stolen retirement funds converted into ice sculptures, silk draperies, and lavish floral walls. It was a sickening display of stolen triumph, and I walked right through the center of it with my dying wife. I navigated the wheelchair through the sea of expensive suits and designer gowns, receiving a mix of polite nods and quick, uncomfortable glances from the guests. Patty kept her head held high, her hands resting elegantly in her lap, radiating a quiet, dignified grace that commanded respect. We made our way toward the massive elevated head table positioned at the far end of the ballroom. The table was draped in shimmering silver linen, overflowing with cascading white orchids that framed the plush, high-backed chairs reserved for the bridal party. I parked Patty's wheelchair at her designated spot, locking the wheels and ensuring she had a clear view of the dance floor. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a brief moment, to gather her strength, the chaotic noise of the reception clearly overwhelming her weakened senses. I stood closely beside her, a silent, immovable guardian scanning the room for the two people whose lives I was about to systematically dismantle. The grand double doors at the entrance of the ballroom suddenly swung open, and a hush fell over the massive crowd. The string quartet smoothly transitioned into a triumphant, soaring melody. Lucas and Victoria made their grand entrance as husband and wife, stepping into the room to a chorus of thunderous applause and cheering from their wealthy audience. Lucas wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, his face flushed, a forced plastic smile plastered across his features. He looked exhausted, his eyes darting nervously around the room, clearly carrying the invisible, crushing weight of the federal bank fraud he had committed. He knew the walls of his lies were precariously thin, and he moved with the rigid, uncomfortable posture of a man waiting for a trapdoor to open beneath his feet. Victoria, however, was in her absolute element. She floated into the ballroom in a breathtaking custom-designed gown encrusted with thousands of tiny crystals. She waved to the cheering crowd, blowing kisses to her real estate colleagues, soaking in the admiration and the envy like a sponge. She gripped my son's arm tightly, steering him through the crowd, with the aggressive confidence of a predator who had successfully captured her prize. She had the mansion in Aspen, she had the lavish wedding, and she believed she had successfully neutralized my wife. She was completely intoxicated by her own perceived brilliance. They slowly made their way toward the elevated head table, stopping to pose for the team of professional photographers documenting their every move. As Victoria approached the platform, her brilliant, practiced smile faltered. She stopped walking, her eyes locking directly onto the space where I had parked Patty's wheelchair. The distance between us was less than 15 feet, close enough for me to see the immediate visceral flash of pure irritation that twisted her perfectly contoured face. She did not see a loving mother fighting through agonizing pain to support her son. She did not see a woman whose medical treatments she was actively sabotaging. Victoria only saw a glaring, unacceptable flaw in the visual perfection of her highly curated event. The metallic frame of the wheelchair and the undeniable reality of illness did not fit the wealthy, flawless image she was aggressively projecting to her high society guests. She stood completely still, her jaw tightening as she stared at the quiet, fragile woman sitting at the end of the table. One of her bridesmaids, a tall woman, wearing a pale pink silk dress, stepped up closely beside the bride, noticing the sudden halt. Victoria leaned her head slightly toward the bridesmaid, never taking her cold, resentful eyes off my wife. The loud music and the cheering crowd masked the conversation from the rest of the room, but I had positioned myself perfectly. I watched her lips move, and I heard the sharp, venomous whisper cut through the surrounding noise with absolute chilling clarity. She let out a sharp sigh of profound annoyance, gripping her bouquet so tightly, her knuckles paled, and muttered that the old woman was completely ruining the aesthetic of the wedding photos with her depressing, sickly aura. I stood silently beside my innocent wife, my heart turning into a solid block of ice. I gently placed my hand upon Patty's trembling shoulder, offering the comfort she desperately needed while my eyes remained fixed on Victoria. The trap was fully armed. The absolute destruction of their stolen paradise was now inevitable. The lavish dinner service dragged on for what felt like an eternity. Course after course of imported delicacies were placed before us, served on gold-rimmed china that glinted under the harsh light of the crystal chandeliers. I sat perfectly still beside my wife, watching the opulent circus unfold with the detached clinical observation of a coroner. The champagne flowed endlessly, poured by waiters who hovered like anxious ghosts around the high society guests. Every clink of crystal, every burst of shallow networking laughter served as a grating reminder of the stolen millions currently funding this grotesque charade. Lucas sat completely paralyzed at the center of the head table. He had abandoned his meal entirely, choosing instead to systematically drain glass after glass of dark bourbon. The heavy liquor did nothing to ease the frantic, terrified shifting of his eyes. He was a man waiting for an executioner he could not see. He never once looked in our direction. He never checked to see if his dying mother was comfortable. He simply stared down at the expensive silk tablecloth, drowning his profound cowardice in expensive alcohol. Victoria, conversely, was thriving. She moved through the grand ballroom with the intoxicating manic energy of someone who believed she had successfully conquered the world. The alcohol had stripped away any lingering semblance of basic human decency. She laughed too loudly, draped herself over the shoulders of wealthy real estate developers, and demanded constant, unrelenting attention from every single person in the room. She was practically vibrating with a toxic combination of expensive champagne and unchecked narcissism. When she finally returned to the head table, she did not sit down. She paced behind the chairs, her custom-beaded gown rustling like a nest of vipers. I watched the aggressive flush of alcohol spreading across her chest and neck. She kept shooting sharp, resentful glares toward my wife. Patty had barely touched her catered meal. The heavy floral perfumes and the overwhelming noise were taking a brutal toll on her fragile system. She sat quietly, with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her breathing shallow, doing absolutely everything in her power to remain invisible so her son could enjoy his perfect day. She was completely oblivious to the vicious, predatory gaze of the woman standing just a few feet away. The clinking of silverware against crystal signaled the beginning of the evening speeches. The string quartet faded into silence. The low murmur of 300 guests slowly died down as the spotlight shifted to the center of the room. Lucas was supposed to speak first, according to the elegant gold-embossed programs placed at every table setting. But Victoria did not allow it. Before my son could even attempt to stand up, she snatched the silver microphone directly from the master of ceremonies. She tapped the heavy metallic grill twice, the sharp, echoing thuds slicing through the quiet ballroom. She stood at the very edge of the elevated platform, looking down at the sea of faces with a wide, dangerous smile. She began her speech with the standard hollow platitudes. She thanked her wealthy colleagues for attending, making sure to drop the names of several prominent luxury developers in the audience. She spoke about her immaculate vision for the future, detailing the massive architectural projects she planned to spearhead now that she was a married woman with substantial newly acquired capital. She spoke exclusively about herself, her ambitions, and her exquisite taste. She did not mention my son's name once during the first 5 minutes of her address. Lucas simply sat there, staring at the bottom of his empty bourbon glass, a pathetic accessory in her grand production. Then the tone of her voice began to fundamentally change. The practiced corporate sweetness completely evaporated, replaced by a slurred, aggressive edge. She took a slow, deliberate sip from her champagne flute and let out a harsh, echoing laugh. She told the crowded room that weddings were historically about pretending. She declared that for far too long, society had forced people to hide behind polite smiles and manufactured perfection. She gripped the microphone tighter, her knuckles turning white. She announced that she was absolutely sick of pretending. She claimed that this new chapter of her life, funded by her own hard work and brilliant investments, was going to be defined by raw, unfiltered authenticity. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The wealthy brokers exchanged confused, worried glances, uncertain if this was a planned part of the entertainment or the beginning of a public meltdown. Victoria ignored the shifting mood of the room. She began pacing back and forth across the front of the platform, her voice rising in pitch and volume. She declared that her new family was going to stop hiding their ugly realities behind closed doors. She stated that weakness and fragility were pathetic anchors dragging successful people down. She preached that those who were strong, those who were beautiful and capable had a moral obligation to prune away the dead branches of their lives. Her words were sharp, vicious daggers disguised as a bizarre motivational monologue. The silence in the ballroom became suffocating. The tension was so thick, it felt like the air itself had been completely removed from the venue. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the handles of Patty's wheelchair, watching the beautiful, terrifying monster my son had chosen finally reveal her true face to the world. Victoria abruptly stopped her frantic pacing across the long stage. She stood perfectly still at the exact center of the platform. She slowly lowered the expensive crystal champagne glass away from her glossy red lips. She slowly turned her entire body, completely ignoring the 300 wealthy guests, completely ignoring her paralyzed, terrified husband. Her cold, predatory eyes locked directly onto my frail, terrified wife. The bright spotlight followed her slow movements, casting a harsh, blinding beam over the corner of the table where Patty and I were sitting. Victoria began to walk. She took slow, deliberate, stumbling steps toward our end of the platform, Her beaded gown dragged heavily across the polished wood. She never broke eye contact with Patty. The malicious, arrogant smirk twisting her face deepened with every single step she took. She was no longer performing for the massive, silent crowd. She was zeroing in on the weakest target in the room, driven by a cruel, intoxicated desire to display her absolute dominance. I felt a sudden, sharp tremor run through Patty's fragile body. My wife reached back, her cold, trembling fingers frantically searching for my hand. I intertwined my fingers with hers, giving her a firm, silent squeeze. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion, but every muscle in my body immediately locked into place. I watched Victoria raise the microphone back up to her lips, closing the final few feet between us. I knew exactly what kind of monster she truly was. I knew what she was capable of. The trap was ready to spring tomorrow, but as I watched her towering over my sick, defenseless wife, I realized with absolute horrifying certainty that Victoria was about to do something unspeakable right now. The harsh glare of the spotlight illuminated the cruel, intoxicated triumph on her face. Victoria leaned into the silver microphone, the sharp feedback echoing off the mirrored walls of the grand ballroom. She let out a dramatic sigh. She stated that her wedding demanded absolute transparency. She slurred slightly, the expensive champagne muddling her pronunciation. She declared that for far too long, the people in this family had hidden behind fake appearances. She claimed that weakness was a choice, a manipulative performance designed to steal attention from those who truly deserved the spotlight. Her eyes, dark and entirely devoid of human empathy, bored into the terrified face of my wife. Patty shrank back against the leather upholstery of her wheelchair, her breathing shallow and erratic. She raised her frail hands, instinctively clutching the collar of her dress, bracing herself for a verbal assault. But Victoria was not satisfied with mere words. She wanted a physical demonstration of her absolute dominance. She wanted to break the woman who had dared to bring the ugly reality of mortality into her perfect, glittering sanctuary. Victoria took one final deliberate step forward, closing the distance. She did not issue a warning. She did not offer a final cutting remark. She simply reached out with her left hand, her manicured fingers curling like the talons of a bird of prey. With a swift, violent motion, she grabbed a thick handful of Patty's chestnut wig. My wife let out a sharp, breathless gasp of pure terror as Victoria yanked her arm backward. The sudden force of the motion snapped Patty's head back against the wheelchair. The hairpins meticulously placed to secure the synthetic hair to her fragile scalp tore away. The wig came off entirely, dangling from Victoria's fist like a hunting trophy. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of the act seemed to freeze the very air in the room. Victoria held the wig aloft for a fraction of a second, a victorious, utterly deranged smirk twisting her features before she casually tossed it over her shoulder. It landed on the pristine white tablecloth, a dark, lifeless heap among the imported orchids and crystal champagne flutes. The brilliant, unforgiving light of the crystal chandeliers beat down directly upon my wife. Patty was left completely exposed, her bare scalp pale and marked by the harsh chemical ravages of intense chemotherapy, was laid bare before 300 wealthy strangers. She looked impossibly small, stripped of the final desperate layer of dignity she had fought so hard to maintain. A guttural, agonizing sob tore from her throat, a sound of such profound humiliation and despair that it will haunt my nightmares until the day I die. She brought her trembling, thin hands up to her face, attempting to hide her shame from the hundreds of eyes suddenly locked upon her. Her narrow shoulders shook violently as she wept, her small frame collapsing inward, crushed by the overwhelming weight of the public degradation. She had endured months of grueling medical treatments, faced the terrifying prospect of her own mortality, and pushed through agonizing pain just to witness her son's happiness. And this was her reward. This public execution of her pride was the gift her future daughter-in-law had chosen to bestow upon her. For 5 agonizing seconds, the grand ballroom was plunged into a dead, suffocating silence. The wealthy real estate brokers, the luxury developers, and the high society elite sat completely paralyzed, their champagne glasses suspended in midair. The sheer shock of the assault held the entire room hostage. Then the silence was shattered by a sound far worse than the initial gasp. From the corner of the head table, the soft, cruel sound of drunken giggling erupted. Victoria's bridesmaids, clad in their pale pink silk dresses, were covering their mouths, exchanging amused, condescending glances as they looked at my weeping wife. Their laughter was a sickening endorsement of the atrocity that had just occurred. I slowly turned my head, shifting my gaze away from the laughing women and looking directly at my son. Lucas was standing barely 10 feet away. He had watched his bride physically assault his dying mother. He saw the bare-scarred scalp of the woman who had raised him. He heard the agonizing sobs echoing through the silent room. He had the opportunity to step forward, to be a man, to shield his mother from the cruelty he had brought into her life. Instead, Lucas took a distinct, deliberate step backward. He lowered his head, staring intently at the polished floorboards, completely surrendering to his cowardice. He did absolutely nothing. He allowed the humiliation to continue, paralyzed by his own pathetic weakness and his absolute submission to the monster he was about to marry. The final lingering ember of hope I held for my family was permanently extinguished, replaced by a cold, calculating void. The time for playing the weak, grieving father had officially concluded. I did not yell. I did not scream or curse or throw my glass across the room. A public tantrum would only feed the chaotic, dramatic spectacle Victoria was so desperately trying to create. I possessed something far more dangerous than blind rage. I possessed absolute total control over their entire future. I slowly stood up from my chair. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, and executed with the chilling precision of a judge delivering a death sentence. The movement drew the immediate attention of the room. The cruel giggling from the bridesmaids abruptly died in their throats. I reached up and calmly unbuttoned my tailored suit jacket. I slipped it off my shoulders with methodical care, letting the heavy, expensive fabric drape over my arm. I stepped forward, positioning my body between the blinding spotlight and my weeping wife. I gently draped the dark jacket over Patty's trembling head and shoulders, providing her with a desperate shield of privacy and dignity against the hundreds of staring eyes. I smoothed the lapels down around her neck, whispering a soft, steady promise that everything was going to be completely fine and that she was perfectly safe. She clutched the fabric of my jacket with desperate, shaking fingers, burying her face into the dark wool. Once I was absolutely certain she was shielded from the harsh light and the cruel stares, I slowly turned around. I squared my shoulders, ignoring the silent, terrified crowd, and focused my entire existence on the woman standing on the platform. I looked directly into Victoria's eyes, watching the arrogant, intoxicated triumph on her face slowly curdle into a sudden, deep-seated confusion. She had expected me to break down. She had expected me to cry or scream, playing the role of the defeated, helpless victim. She had absolutely no idea that she was staring into the eyes of the man who held the legal authority to seize her mansion, freeze her assets, and summon the federal authorities to lock her in a penitentiary. The trap was ready, the FBI agents were briefed, and the final hour of her stolen paradise had officially begun. I simply stood there, staring her down in the absolute silence, ready to unleash a hell she could not possibly comprehend. I gently withdrew my hand from my wife's trembling fingers, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze before I moved. The grand ballroom remained frozen in that suffocating silence, shattered only by an occasional gasp from a guest who finally understood the gravity of the assault. I stepped away from the head table and began the long, deliberate walk toward the center of the platform. My footsteps echoed softly against the polished hardwood, measured and entirely unhurried. I wanted Victoria to feel the heavy weight of my approach. I wanted the hundreds of wealthy brokers and high society elites to watch the precise moment the glittering illusion of her perfect life crumbled into dust. As I slowly closed the distance, Victoria's initial confusion morphed back into her toxic, arrogant confidence. She believed my calm demeanor was a sign of total submission. She assumed that, like my cowardly son, I was stepping forward to apologize, to smooth over the awkwardness, to surrender completely to her dominance to avoid a public scene. She stood under the harsh spotlight, the silver microphone clutched tightly in her hand, her chest heaving slightly from the alcohol and the sudden adrenaline of her cruel stunt. When I was just a few feet away, she leaned back and let out a soft, condescending chuckle. It was a terrible sound, designed to reduce me to the status of a defeated, obedient servant in front of her peers. I stopped directly in front of her. I did not let a single trace of the boiling rage inside my chest reach my face. I reached smoothly into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and retrieved the thick, heavy manila envelope Thomas Gallagher had handed me 24 hours prior. The crisp white paper caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, creating a stark contrast to the glittering beads sewn into her wedding gown. Victoria looked down at the envelope. Her eyes immediately gleamed with absolute, greedy certainty. She brought the silver microphone back up to her red lips, turning her head slightly so her voice would project flawlessly over the massive sound system she had demanded. She smirked, a vicious, triumphant curl of her mouth, revealing her absolute lack of humanity. "Oh, look," she slurred smoothly, her voice bouncing off the mirrored walls. "The old man is finally handing over the warehouse deed. It certainly took you long enough to realize who is actually running this family." A low murmur rippled through the audience. A few friends clapped politely, foolishly, assuming this was a planned part of the family dynamic. Lucas, however, did not clap. I saw him entirely out of the corner of my eye. He had finally lifted his heavy head from the floor, and his face had completely drained of all color. He was staring at the thick white envelope with a sudden dawning terror, perhaps recognizing the heavy distinctive watermark of a premier Chicago law firm, or perhaps simply realizing that I would never hand over the legal deed to my commercial empire in such a quiet, defeated manner. But Victoria noticed absolutely none of this. She was completely blinded by her own ravenous ambition and her intoxicating sense of power. I held the envelope out to her. My hand was perfectly steady. She snatched it from my grasp with the eager, violent grace of a starving animal. She did not bother to carefully open the protective flap. She dug her sharp manicured nails under the tight seal and aggressively ripped the thick paper apart, tearing the top edge in her desperate haste. She pulled out the dense stack of legal documents. I watched her dark eyes dart to the top of the very first page. I watched the exact fraction of a second when her alcohol-soaked brain processed the large, bold, unforgiving legal header printed across the premium paper. Notice of acceleration. Demand for payment in full. $2,500,000. The physical transformation was absolute and immediate. The drunken, arrogant flush completely vanished from her chest and neck, replaced instantly by an ashen, sickly pallor that made her look like a ghost. The cruel, mocking smirk was entirely wiped away, leaving her mouth hanging slightly open in pure, unadulterated shock. Her hands, which had so violently ripped the chestnut wig from my dying wife's head just moments ago, began to tremble uncontrollably. The thick pages of the legal notice shook violently, rustling loudly against the sensitive microphone she was still clutching in her left hand. She blinked rapidly, her eyes frantically scanning the dense, complicated legal text, desperately searching for a punchline, a terrible mistake, or an elusive loophole. She read the strict clauses detailing the immediate seizure of the unlisted luxury mansion located in Aspen. She read the aggressive clauses demanding the immediate freezing of all secondary shell company assets. But far more importantly, she read the specific name of the anonymous offshore trust that now officially held her fraudulent debt, and she saw my personal signature clearly listed as the sole managing director. She slowly raised her wide eyes from the paper. The look she gave me was no longer predatory or dominant. It was the frantic, hollow stare of trapped prey, realizing the cage had slammed shut. She took a stumbling, uncoordinated step backward, the heel of her expensive designer shoe catching roughly on the long hem of her custom gown. She turned her head frantically toward Lucas, offering a silent, desperate plea for an explanation for a rescue, but my son was already rapidly retreating. Lucas had backed away from the head table entirely, pressing his shaking shoulders hard against the mirrored wall of the ballroom, looking as though he might be physically sick. He understood exactly what those complex legal papers meant. He knew the devastating acceleration clause had been formally triggered. He knew they had exactly 24 hours to magically produce $2.5 million in liquid cash, or they would face immediate federal indictment for severe bank fraud. Victoria very slowly turned her face back to me. Her glossy lips moved, but absolutely no sound came out at all. She looked down at the silver microphone in her hand, as if she had entirely forgotten what it was. I took one deliberate step forward, completely closing the small physical distance between us. I did not violently snatch the microphone from her trembling, weak fingers. I simply leaned forward, positioning my mouth just inches away from the metallic silver grill. The grand ballroom was so incredibly quiet that even the ambient humming noise of the building seemed to have completely vanished. The hundreds of wealthy elite guests held their collective breath, completely captivated by the unraveling, disastrous spectacle occurring right on the platform. I looked directly into the terrified, weeping eyes of the incredibly wicked woman who had actively sought to destroy my family and my life. I spoke perfectly clearly, my voice suddenly resonating with cold, lethal authority over the massive speakers. You didn't borrow from a bank, Victoria. You borrowed from me. And because you forged my signature to commit federal bank fraud, the loan is due today, right now. The silver microphone slipped from her trembling fingers. It struck the polished hardwood platform with a deafening high-pitched squeal of feedback that made several guests in the front row flinch and cover their ears. Victoria did not attempt to pick it up. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, erratic gasps, staring at me as if the devil himself had just manifested in the middle of her fairy tale wedding. The heavy, suffocating silence of the grand ballroom finally shattered, replaced by a rising, chaotic murmur from the 300 elite guests. From the far side of the platform, the frantic sound of heavy footsteps echoed clearly over the murmuring crowd. Lucas scrambled up the side stairs, his face drained of every ounce of color. He looked exactly like a man walking to his own public execution. He stepped directly between Victoria and me, raising his shaking hands in a pathetic, pleading gesture. He stammered, his voice cracking, asking me what all of this was. He begged me to listen, insisting that they could explain everything, that this was just a massive misunderstanding, blown completely out of proportion, and that we urgently needed to step into a private room to sort out our family business. I slowly bent down and retrieved the silver microphone from the polished floor. I stood back up, my posture perfectly straight, and looked directly into my son's panicked eyes. I brought the microphone to my lips, ensuring that my voice carried flawlessly over the state-of-the-art sound system. I told him there was absolutely nothing left to explain. I turned my cold gaze out toward the massive sea of wealthy real estate brokers, luxury developers, and high society clients that Victoria had carefully invited to witness her social triumph. I decided it was finally time to formally introduce them to the real Victoria. I spoke with brutal, clinical precision. I informed the entire room that the extravagant wedding they were currently attending was funded entirely by stolen money. I detailed exactly how my son and his bride had forged my personal signature on federal documents to illegally secure a $2.5 million commercial loan against my logistics business. A sharp collective gasp instantly rippled through the grand ballroom. I watched as dozens of stunned guests, people whose professional lives depended entirely on ultimate trust and unyielding financial integrity, immediately pulled out their smartphones. The glowing screens illuminated the dim room as they began recording every single word I proudly said. I did not stop. I explicitly detailed how they had funneled those stolen funds through an incredibly complex web of anonymous shell companies to completely hide their tracks. I brilliantly revealed that while they pretended to physically struggle financially, they had secretly purchased a sprawling, unlisted luxury mansion up in Aspen, California. I watched Victoria's previously pristine professional reputation utterly disintegrate before my very eyes. Her wealthy, connected colleagues were absolutely no longer looking at her with superficial admiration or envy. They were looking directly at her with pure, unadulterated, and undeniable disgust. The social empire she had spent countless years aggressively building was actively burning down to the ground in a mere matter of devastating seconds. But the massive financial fraud was only the beginning of my public speech. I turned my back to the stunned crowd and walked slowly toward the edge of the platform where my wife sat. Patty was completely silent, hidden safely beneath the thick drape of my tailored suit jacket, gripping the dark fabric with pale, trembling fingers. I looked back at Victoria, letting the absolute, unforgiving venom currently residing inside my soul seep directly into my deep voice. I told the room that the money meant absolutely nothing to me. The true crime, the most unforgivable atrocity, was what they had actually done to the innocent woman who lovingly gave my son life. I told the hundreds of listening guests about the sudden, completely inexplicable decline in Patty's health over the last few painful months. I boldly explained how Victoria had eagerly played the false role of the incredibly loving, devoted daughter-in-law, brewing special herbal teas and preparing holistic soups that were supposedly beautifully designed to effectively aid in her rigorous chemotherapy recovery. The crowd went entirely silent again, hanging on my every single word with a dark, morbid fascination. I revealed that those deeply loving holistic remedies were actually secretly laced with trace amounts of toxic chemicals carefully and maliciously calculated to interact violently with her prescribed cancer medications. They were not trying to heal her. They were actively, methodically attempting to artificially accelerate her death so they could rapidly claim the remainder of my entire estate without waiting patiently for nature to take its course. The reaction from the grand ballroom was instantaneous and powerfully visceral. Several women cried out in genuine horror. Men shouted in angry outrage. The glowing sea of camera phones pressed closer to the stage, flawlessly capturing the sheer, undeniable terror currently paralyzing the bride and groom. The absolute public exposure utterly broke whatever remained of Victoria's fragile, incredibly narcissistic sanity. The sheer crushing weight of the public humiliation triggered a desperate feral survival instinct within her mind. She lunged forward, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. She began to scream at the absolute top of her lungs, her voice cracking with hysterical, unhinged panic. She shrieked wildly that I was a completely senile old man making up delusional lies to violently ruin her beautiful life. She desperately tried to convince her wealthy, powerful colleagues that this was a totally pathetic, empty bluff, perfectly designed by a bitterly controlling father who simply wanted to maliciously ruin her incredibly special day. She frantically signaled to the country club security guards standing near the perimeter of the room, aggressively demanding that they forcibly remove me from the private premises immediately. She screamed that I had absolutely no solid proof of these highly outrageous allegations and that she was absolutely not going to let me effectively destroy her newly flawless reputation. She took another intensely aggressive step forward, her pale face twisted into a truly grotesque mask of pure, blinding desperation, looking as though she was fully preparing to physically push me directly off the raised platform. But before she could possibly close the final remaining distance, the highly polished, heavy, solid mahogany double doors positioned exactly at the main entrance of the grand ballroom suddenly swung completely open with a deeply resounding, massive, thunderous crash. The heavy wood slammed violently against the plastered walls, instantly cutting off Victoria's shrill, hysterical screaming. Every single head located inside the massive, crowded room turned simultaneously toward the sudden, explosive noise. Standing perfectly framed right in the grand entryway was my personal attorney, Thomas Gallagher. He held a remarkably thick, black leather briefcase securely in his right hand, his tight expression carved from solid, unforgiving granite. Flanking him on either side, moving with swift, highly synchronized, and totally unmistakable authority, were three stern, heavily built men wearing dark, tactical windbreakers. The bright gold shields of the Federal Bureau of Investigation gleamed clearly on their leather belts. The heavy polished doors remained pinned against the walls, framing the absolute destruction of Victoria's meticulously crafted illusion. Thomas Gallagher stepped fully into the brilliantly lit ballroom, his leather briefcase swinging with methodical precision at his side. The three federal agents moved flawlessly in formation around him, their heavy black boots thudding against the imported marble floors. They bypassed the lavishly decorated guest tables, their stern, unyielding expressions cutting a stark path through the paralyzed sea of wealthy socialites. Under strict United States law, the combination of wire fraud, deliberate bank forgery, and the malicious diversion of multi-million-dollar funds required immediate, non-negotiable detainment. There would be no polite summons. There would be no quiet behind-the-scenes negotiations with expensive defense attorneys. This was a direct public execution of justice, precisely as I had meticulously orchestrated over the past few grueling weeks to ensure their absolute downfall. Victoria stood completely frozen on the elevated platform, her manicured hands hovering uselessly in the empty air. The blinding spotlight still illuminated her ashen, terrified face. The aggressive, intoxicated bravado that had fueled her horrific assault on my wife had entirely evaporated, replaced by the primitive, frantic panic of a trapped animal. The lead federal agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a closely cropped haircut, reached the edge of the stage. He did not hesitate. He did not offer a polite greeting. He firmly instructed Victoria to place her hands behind her back, clearly stating her full legal name and immediately reciting the extensive list of federal felony charges she was currently facing. He explicitly mentioned the forged commercial loan documents, the illegal wire transfers to the anonymous offshore accounts, and the fraudulent purchase of the Aspen property. Victoria recoiled as if she had been physically struck. She took a frantic, stumbling step backward, the heavy, crystal-encrusted train of her $15,000 wedding gown tangling dangerously around her ankles. She shrieked that they were making a catastrophic mistake, demanding that they check their records, insisting that she was a prominent, highly respected luxury developer who could not be treated like a common criminal. The federal agents were completely unfazed by her hysterical screaming. Two of the men stepped smoothly onto the platform, flanking her instantly. They grasped her arms with practiced, immovable force. Victoria thrashed violently, her diamond tiara slipping from her perfectly styled hair and clattering onto the floor. The sharp, unmistakable click of heavy metal handcuffs echoing through the silent room sounded like the ultimate final closing of a vault. The cold steel locked securely around her wrists, effectively pinning her arms behind the delicate, sheer lace back of her extravagant designer gown. Seeing his powerful, dominant bride reduced to a shrieking, restrained prisoner finally shattered whatever fragile mental barrier Lucas had been clinging to. He violently pushed himself away from the mirrored wall, his face streaked with sudden, desperate tears. He scrambled across the polished stage, his expensive tuxedo jacket slipping off his shoulder. He threw himself forcefully onto the hardwood floor, landing heavily on his knees directly at my feet. He reached out with shaking, sweaty hands, desperately grabbing the fabric of my trousers. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, childish terror, completely ignoring the federal agents securing his new wife. He sobbed uncontrollably, begging me to stop them, pleading that we were a family, and that we could simply talk about everything behind closed doors. He swore that he never wanted any of this to happen, that Victoria had manipulated him, and that he was incredibly sorry for everything. I did not step back. I did not attempt to pull my legs away from his frantic, desperate grasp. I simply stood there looking down at the weeping, pathetic creature, groveling on the floor. I felt absolutely no warmth, no pity, and no paternal instinct toward him. My heart was a solid, impenetrable block of glacial ice. I looked directly into his red, swollen eyes, making absolutely certain he heard every single syllable I was about to deliver. I kept my voice incredibly calm, yet it resonated with a devastating absolute finality. I told him that he had stood silently by while the woman he loved, slowly and deliberately, poisoned his own mother. I reminded him that he had chosen to look away, choosing cowardly submission over basic human decency. I explicitly pointed out that he had stood perfectly still, and allowed his bride to violently rip the wig from his dying mother's head, and that he had allowed those cruel bridesmaids to laugh at her profound humiliation. I stated perfectly clearly that a man who could watch his innocent mother suffer such agonizing abuse for the sake of a stolen mansion was no longer a part of my bloodline. I looked down at him with profound, unyielding disgust and told him that he was absolutely no son of mine. Lucas collapsed forward, burying his face against my shoes, wailing with a pathetic, hollow grief that generated no sympathy. I smoothly stepped out of his weak grasp, stepping carefully around his trembling body. Behind me, Victoria had completely lost the final remnants of her sanity. She was screaming like a wild, untamed banshee, kicking her expensive heels and twisting violently against the firm grip of the federal agents. Her hideous shrieks of rage and denial echoed terribly off the high ceilings as they physically dragged her down the stairs and forcefully marched her down the long center aisle of the ballroom. The 300 elite guests did not stay to offer their support. The wealthy brokers, the developers, and the high society socialites were already scrambling frantically toward the side exits, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of a massive federal criminal investigation. The grand, opulent wedding had officially disintegrated into total, irreversible ruin. I turned my back on the absolute chaos, completely dismissing my sobbing former son from my reality. I walked back to the edge of the table where my beloved wife patiently sat. Patty was still trembling softly beneath the heavy protective drape of my dark suit jacket. I knelt down securely beside her metallic wheelchair, gently placing my warm hands directly over hers. I spoke to her in a soft, deeply comforting whisper, promising her that the terrifying nightmare was permanently over, that the cruel monsters had been completely removed from our lives, and that absolutely nobody would ever be allowed to maliciously hurt or publicly humiliate her again. I slowly stood back up and securely gripped the rubber handles of her medical wheelchair. I did not cast a single glance back at Lucas, who was still weeping alone on the completely empty stage. I turned the wheelchair around and began to deliberately push Patty smoothly across the imported marble floors, navigating a calm, steady, and extremely careful path through the numerous overturned wooden chairs, the hastily abandoned crystal champagne flutes, and the scattered, completely useless imported white roses. We walked slowly and quietly out of the ruined, empty ballroom, together, completely leaving the shattered, aggressively burning remains of Lucas and Victoria's desperately stolen life far behind us in the cold dark. The passage of 3 months felt less like a simple turning of calendar pages and much more like emerging from a suffocating, lightless cavern into the brilliant warmth of a new morning. The chaotic, aggressive fallout from that disastrous wedding reception at the Chicago Country Club was swift, merciless, and absolutely final. Victoria and Lucas never even saw the inside of a honeymoon suite. Instead, they were immediately transported into federal custody, where they have remained securely locked in federal holding cells without the possibility of bail. The sheer scale and brazen audacity of their financial crimes, combined with the incredibly compelling evidence of their malicious tampering with my wife's medical treatments, prompted the federal judge to classify them both as extreme flight risks. The magnificent, unlisted luxury mansion hidden away in Aspen, along with the custom designer wardrobe, the expensive diamond jewelry, and the sleek new Porsche they had so arrogantly paraded around the city, were immediately seized by government authorities. Their sprawling, meticulously curated empire of lies collapsed into a pile of worthless ash. I systematically and permanently divorced my son from every single aspect of my life. I legally removed his name from all inheritance documents, severed every remaining familial tie, and ensured he would never again have the opportunity to cast his dark, toxic shadow over our peaceful existence. He chose his path of greed and cowardice, and now he must walk it entirely alone. The swift, aggressive liquidation of their fraudulently acquired assets successfully returned the stolen $2.5 million directly back into my personal accounts. That recovered money did not go back into a dormant retirement fund. Instead, it became the exact key to unlocking a literal miracle for the woman who deserved it the most. We immediately utilized those recovered funds to enroll Patty in a highly exclusive revolutionary immune cell therapy program at a premier oncology research center. Unburdened by the toxic, chemically laced holistic soups Victoria had been secretly feeding her Patty's fragile body finally had a genuine fighting chance to heal. The transformation over the last 90 days has been nothing short of breathtaking. This morning, the crisp, cool autumn breeze sweeping off the vast expanse of Lake Michigan carried the sweet, unmistakable scent of genuine hope. Patty and I sat quietly side by side on a weathered wooden park bench, watching the gentle, rhythmic waves break against the rocky shoreline. The heavy folding wheelchair that had once confined her was completely gone. She sat upright, her posture radiating a quiet, profound strength that had been absent for far too long. The dark, heavy circles that used to bruise the delicate skin beneath her eyes had entirely faded, replaced by a warm, healthy flush of life. Her recent medical reports confirmed what my own eyes could already clearly see. Her aggressive cancer markers were dropping with miraculous, unprecedented speed. The revolutionary therapy was actively working, targeting and destroying the illness that had nearly stolen her away from me. I reached over and gently took her hand, marveling at the returning warmth in her fingers. I looked at her head, deeply moved by the sight of her beautiful, natural hair beginning to grow back. A soft, elegant crown of silver and chestnut curls was slowly replacing the painful, scarred reality she had endured under the harsh ballroom spotlights. She turned her face toward the bright morning sun, closing her eyes and taking a deep, unhindered breath of the fresh lake air. A serene, beautiful smile touched her lips, completely unburdened by the crushing weight of betrayal and deceit that had suffocated our home for the better part of a year. We had successfully excised the deadly malignant cancer from our family tree just in time. The toxic greed and the profound cruelty that Lucas and Victoria brought into our lives had been completely eradicated, leaving behind a profound, unbreakable peace. We lost a son to the corrupting, relentless allure of wealth and status, but in that painful, necessary severance, we successfully reclaimed our own lives. As I sat there holding my beloved wife's hand, watching the brilliant golden sunlight violently dance across the gently rippling surface of the deep blue water, I knew with absolute, incredibly unwavering certainty that our true story was never going to end in a tragic, quiet defeat. The incredibly chilling memory of that grand, entirely ruined ballroom feels incredibly distant right now, washed away completely by the steady, deeply comforting rhythm of the beautifully crashing waves. We no longer look back at the violently shattered remnants of that dark, painful past. We only look forward to the beautiful mornings we still have left to share together. We had successfully and completely survived the absolute darkest, most devastatingly treacherous storm of our entire lives. Family is often portrayed as an unbreakable bond, but shared blood does not grant anyone the right to abuse, manipulate, or exploit you. True love is always rooted in mutual respect, careful compassion, and deep integrity, never greed. When those closest to you wear masks of deceit, to strip you of your dignity, setting rigid boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of pure survival. Never let the guilt of family ties force you to quietly endure toxic behavior. Protect your peace, safeguard your personal legacy, and remember that walking away is the absolute greatest victory. If this story opened your eyes, please hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss our next thrilling story. Feel completely free to openly share your personal experiences regarding cutting ties with highly toxic family members in the comments section below.